Have you ever been asked a what is more important question in a job interview? For example, what is more important, strategy or execution, and why? And what most people do is they pick one right away and basically defend that one concept very weakly, very poorly. And so in this video, I want to share with you a few specific strategies that I use to answer questions like this one, specifically focusing in on clarification, utilizing a hybrid framework, assumptions and choosing one of these two concepts, and then the power of transitions in these types of answers. And then I'm going to provide a sample answer to this specific question. So let's dive right in. Item one is clarification. And just something about these types of questions almost always leads to an immediate response with no clarification. And maybe because on the surface it seems so straightforward, but you cannot have full confidence in your answer without questions. And specifically for the strategy and execution question, I would focus in on clarification concepts such as timeline, historical data, scope, and maybe stakeholders, for example. And we're going to dive into those specific questions in the sample answer. Item two is a hybrid framework. And this is probably the most unique part of my approach. I want you to create a framework full of concepts that support both strategy and execution so that we can find that middle ground right away and maybe utilize some generic concepts like goals, historical data, timeline, scope and scale, risks, benefits, stakeholders, KPIs, for example. Item three is assumptions. We always want to start off by focusing in on one framework concept at a time as we dive into those assumptions instead of trying to solve for everything. So, for example, you could pick goals as a framework concept to focus in on, but then you need to pick one. In this case, let's just pick the example of we're going to argue for strategy, for example. Picking this definitive path is critical because you're trying to answer the question, and then we want to follow that up with assumptions that are role related. And this will create a very strong connectivity with your interviewer. Item four, after solution transition. And I'm going to provide the solution in a moment in our sample answer, but I just want to focus in on the transition for a second. When you get what is more important questions, the transition is going to start like normal, but then we also have to prompt to arguing for the other concept. So we take that normal path of saying, hey, I could focus a little bit more on A or B, concepts you mentioned in your answer. We could move on to C, which is highlighting one of the framework concepts you haven't focused in on yet. But in these answers, you could say, or we could move on and I could argue for execution. Because now what you've done is you've shown your willingness to defend that strategy concept, but you've also shown a willingness to flip the script and argue for the other item. Really, really critical that we build that strong transition. It will really impress your audience. So let's do it. Item five, sample answer. And so I'm going to assume that I'm interviewing for a program manager role focused in on devices at Google. And we're always going to go and start with our trusty interviewer, Sue. And for this answer, let's assume Sue is not responsive. She looks at us, smiles at us, stares at us, but doesn't actually answer any of our questions. So let's dive in. Jeff, tell me what's more important, strategy or execution, and why? Thanks, Sue. I have a few clarifying questions. I would really want to understand right off the bat, are we in the beginning, middle, or end of this initiative? Okay, well, I'd also be curious on a few other items. I'd want to know if we've ever done anything like this in the past, yes or no. I'd be thinking about the scope. Is the scope of the overall initiative small, medium, or large? And then lastly, I'd be curious about the stakeholders. Are we working with internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, or both? Sue, can you answer any of these questions for me? Okay, a few concepts we should focus in on in order to solve are, we absolutely want to look at the goals. We want to be thinking about that historical data. We're going to be thinking about that timeline and the scope and scale. We want to be thinking about the risks and benefits, the key stakeholders, and then ultimately be looking at those KPIs. I think we should start by focusing in on goals, but is there another area you'd want to focus in on? Okay, let's start by focusing in on the goals, and I'm going to go ahead and argue for strategy. Let's also add in a couple of small assumptions. Let's assume that the goal is to release a new Google Pixel tablet, and let's say the timeline is end of 2023. Let's say holiday season 2023. So the first goal should really be defining our target audience. And we might want to bring in the research team to really focus in on who our target audience could be and maybe start to define what the overall demographics look like, both in the US and globally. Now, the next goal would be reach. We really want to start to think in the beginning how we're going to reach this audience, and that's where I'd probably bring in the marketing team to start thinking about the communication, the messaging, and the platforms we might use to reach this target audience. Now, after focusing in on the audience, we're going to have to strategize and think about what is the purpose behind these overall goals? What are we trying to solve for? By not only focusing in on the who, but now the why. And this is probably going to bring in stakeholders from Eng to product to UX and of course marketing, sales, etc. So we've established the why. Now we want to talk a little bit about the buying journey. This is where we're really probably going to bring in more of the sales team, and then we'll move on and talk a little bit about validation. We really do want to validate as part of our strategy that the market really wants another tablet, and how can we learn from what our competitors have done. And then once we've done a lot of this upfront work, we are going to want to work on a strategic, comprehensive plan and bring in all those teams again. And we might use some simple formulas such as doing a SWOT analysis, looking at the overall ROI, and making sure lastly that within this strategic vision of our goals that we have full alignment. Now, Sue, probably the next best step is entering the first phase of the program and arguing for the strategy, but we could also dive a little bit deeper into the audience. We could talk a lot more about the competition, another important area. We could go back to one of those initial concepts I mentioned in risk, which would also be very interesting to discuss from a strategy perspective, or I am more than happy to flip the script and argue for execution. Is there one item or one area you want me to discuss? And that's it. That's our sample answer. Good luck. These questions are super, super tricky, but if you take this approach, I know you'll have great success. Thanks.